I've learned that sometimes the mountains don't wait for dawn to teach you something. Sometimes they choose the hour when even your own heartbeat sounds too loud, when the world forgets your name for a moment, and all you have left is the truth of who you are. My name is Daniel Rourke. I'm 36, born and raised on the Tennessee side of the Smokies, and I've spent more nights than I can count wandering ridgelines and old pioneer trails. But what happened at Clingman's Dome on a night I will never forget showed me that no man, no matter how local or seasoned, truly knows these mountains after midnight. I'd camped there a dozen times before, usually tucked between the Fraser Firs just off the Forney Ridge Trail. That night had started like any other, quiet, a little cold, and wrapped in the kind of stillness that makes you breathe softer. I'd made camp just after sunset, cooked a simple meal, and sat listening to the wind threading through the ghost-like silhouettes of dead timber left behind by the old balsam woolly adelgid. There's always been something somber about those trees, like they're holding their breath, waiting for someone to finally understand what they've been trying to say for decades. I used to think that feeling was just my imagination. But the forest has a way of correcting your assumptions. The first strange thing didn't feel strange at all. Not yet. Around midnight, while I was sitting outside my tent with the stove cooling beside me, I heard what sounded like a voice carried on the wind. Not clear words, nothing you'd recognize, just a soft murmur, like someone trying to speak underwater. The Smokies are known for their acoustic illusions. Wind rolls over the ridges and valleys in ways that can turn a single gust into what sounds like 100 distant whispers. I told myself it was just that, an old mountain trick. But the sound came again, lingering a second too long, as if waiting to see whether I heard it, and that tiny hesitation, that almost human pause, settled into my chest, heavier than any fear I'd felt in years. I tried to shake it off. I even laughed at myself, one of those uneasy, shallow laughs you force out just to prove you're still in control. But control doesn't mean much at 6,600 feet when the darkness seems to press in from every direction. I crawled into my tent, zipped it up tight, and told myself I was tired. That's when the forest went silent, and not the usual quiet that comes with nightfall. This was a vacuum. No wind, no insects, not even the faint rustle of needles brushing against one another. Silence so thick it felt like the world had been muted, like everything out there was waiting for something to move first. When the second whisper came, it wasn't on the wind. It was beside my tent. I froze, not out of panic, but out of instinct. I grew up hearing warnings from the old mountain folk who lived deep in the hollers. Don't answer when something calls your name at night. Don't whistle after sunset. Don't go outside when the woods go still. They never explained why. Like they said anyone who needed the explanation wouldn't understand it anyway. Those rules had always felt like superstition, a relic of a time before cell towers and trail apps. But in that moment, lying in my sleeping bag with the fabric of my tent trembling slightly as if someone brushed a finger against it, those warnings became scripture. I listened, holding my breath until my chest ached. At first I thought it was the wind returning, sliding low across the ridgeline, but this sound was shaped, intentional, a slow, dragging whisper that seemed to rise from the ground up. It didn't speak my name. It didn't speak any name. It spoke like it was remembering how. And then I felt it, something moving outside, brushing lightly against the leaves, circling just far enough away that I couldn't make out footsteps, just the shift of weight, something pacing with patience. Fear doesn't hit you all at once. It seeps into you. It starts as logic. Maybe it's a bear, maybe an injured hiker, maybe a trick of acoustics, but then your mind runs out of excuses. And what's left isn't panic, it's clarity. A raw, primal clarity that tells you this isn't normal, this isn't right, and you need to pay attention if you want to see sunrise. I kept my head still, every muscle locked, listening to whatever was outside. The circling stopped, the whispering stopped, and then, with the slow certainty of something that knew exactly where I lay, the sound came again, this time right at my ear, just inches through the nylon wall. Not a whisper, A breath. Warm. Damp. Steady. That was the moment my fear changed. It shifted from the fear of what was out there to the fear of what was inside me. The doubt. The memory of every mistake I'd made in these mountains, every time I'd walked a trail thinking I was the one in charge. These ridges had existed long before me, before my family, before the first settlers carved out a life between their folds. And for the first time, I understood what it meant to be truly alone here. Not abandoned, observed. I don't know how long it stayed there, breathing through the fabric. Maybe seconds, maybe minutes. But when it finally pulled back, I felt the air outside stir, faint but distinct, like something turning away. For the first time since I crawled into the tent, I reached for my headlamp, but I didn't turn it on. Light can be a comfort, but it can also be a challenge. And every instinct I had told me, don't challenge it. Instead, I waited. I listened to the forest slowly returning to life, the distant chirp of a single insect, the soft rise of wind pushing between the trees, the faint cracking of a branch far downhill. But what unsettled me most wasn't what I heard, it was the rhythm of it. Nature has patterns, predictable ones, but that night the sounds came back out of order, mismatched, like the forest was learning how to be a forest again. At 2:13 a.m., though I didn't check my watch until later, the wind carried a final whisper up the ridge, not like the ones before. This one was almost tired, a breath that didn't want to be a voice anymore, a sound that felt older than anything around me, older than the mountain itself, a sound that wasn't meant for me but somehow found me anyway. And here's the part I struggle to explain, even to myself. I wasn't terrified anymore. I was humbled. Whoever I'd been before that moment, a local, a seasoned camper, a guy who thought he understood these woods, I wasn't him now. I was someone who knew the mountains had secrets, and some of those secrets were not meant to be solved, only respected. But the night wasn't finished with me yet. The wind shifted again, carrying the scent of wet stone and fir needles, and with it came the realization that whatever had been outside my tent hadn't left the ridge. It had only stepped back, settling somewhere just beyond the tree line. I could feel its presence, the same way you feel someone watching you in a crowded room, an instinctive pressure against the back of your mind. I didn't hear footsteps or branches snapping. It wasn't moving, and yet it wasn't gone. And that knowledge pressed a slow, icy dread into my spine that made the air inside the tent feel too small, too thin, like I couldn't get enough of it no matter how deep I inhaled. I finally forced myself to unzip the tent, just an inch, just enough to let the smallest thread of cold mountain air slide in. I wasn't planning to look out, not directly. Just breathe, just prove to myself that the world outside still existed, that I was still sharing this ridge with something more than fear. But the moment that crack opened, everything outside went silent again. The wind, the insects, even the distant swaying of the firs, all of it paused. It was as if the night itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what I would do next. I closed the zipper quietly, not out of panic but out of respect, the way you'd close the door to a room where someone is sleeping. And then I sat there in the faint blue glow of my headlamp, still turned off, thinking about the stories the old locals used to tell. Tales of watchers in the high ridges, of voices caught in the hollows, of things that moved differently in the hours when night was at its heaviest. They always said the Smokies had their own laws, older ones, unwritten ones, and the people who survived longest up here were the ones who never tried to rewrite them. I'd never believed those tales completely, but sitting in that tent, surrounded by that heavy, expectant quiet, I felt the weight of those stories as if they'd been waiting their whole lives for me to finally understand them. The emotional dilemma wasn't fear. It was the realization that I had grown arrogant in the place that raised me. I had walked these trails thinking I belonged to the mountains, when the truth was simpler and more humbling. I was a guest, and guests don't get to choose the terms. I don't know how long I stayed awake, listening to the strange pause of the night. Time felt like it was moving sideways instead of forward. Every beat of my heart sounded too loud, echoing in my ribs as if the forest might hear it and decide that was enough reason to draw nearer. Then, just when I thought the silence would swallow me whole, the wind returned, soft, slow, carrying the warmth of something that had been waiting. And then I heard it, my name, not whispered, not spoken, but exhaled. Daniel. The sound slid across the leaves like a breath that had weight. It didn't come from one direction. It curled around the tent, rising and falling like it had been carried up from the valley and funneled into the fabric of my shelter. I didn't answer. Every warning I had ever been taught told me not to. But hearing my own name dissolve into the night like that felt like someone had reached inside my chest and pressed a cold palm directly against my heart. For a moment, I wasn't 36. I wasn't a seasoned camper. I was a kid again, sitting at my grandmother's table while she told me stories about the night folk of the Smokies. Lost voices that clung to the ridge tops, calling out to travelers who wandered too close to the places where sound never died. She told me those voices weren't malicious, but curious, hungry for warmth, drawn to the living, and they always called twice. The second time came right on cue, a soft, dragging breath that carried my name again, but this time the syllables stretched. Daniel, like whoever or whatever said it wasn't used to shaping human sounds and was testing the edges of each letter. My hands trembled. I squeezed them into fists to stop the shaking, because shaking was an answer. Fear was an answer, and the mountains listen carefully to what you give them. I didn't speak, I didn't move, I didn't even breathe for a few seconds. The whisper faded, withdrawing just far enough to slip between the trees like smoke unraveling. And then, through the tent fabric, I heard something soft and deliberate, the shift of weight on the forest floor. Slow, heavy. Something stepping backward, like it had come as close as it dared and was now returning to whatever hollow it had risen from. But it didn't leave without giving me one last warning. The forest exhaled. The ridge groaned with a low, almost metallic hum, and every dead Fraser fir around me creaked at the same time, just once as if struck by the same unseen hand. Then the normal sounds of night returned all at once, insects humming, wind lifting, needles rustling. The shift was so sudden, it felt like someone had flipped a switch on the entire mountain, and I finally breathed again. When sunrise came hours later, I unzipped my tent slowly, deliberately, stepping out into a world that looked exactly the same as it had the night before. But I wasn't the same, because the moment my boots touched the ground, I saw them, marks in the soil. Not footprints, not animal tracks, just impressions, wide, shallow, and irregular, like something had leaned close enough to listen, but had no need for feet. I didn't try to follow them. Some trails aren't mine to take. Instead, I packed up quietly, making sure every piece of gear was returned to its place, every sign of my campsite erased. Not out of fear, but out of gratitude for a night that had stripped me of my pride and handed me something deeper in return. Respect. As I started down Forney Ridge, I paused once and looked back toward the dead fir silhouetted against the pale morning sky. A breeze lifted through them, carrying a sound that might once have been a whisper, but this time it wasn't shaped, wasn't searching. It was simply the wind again. And I understood then that the mountains hadn't been trying to scare me. They were teaching me, reminding me that every step into the deep woods is a conversation. And if you're lucky, if you're quiet enough, humble enough, you might hear the mountains speak back. But never, ever think you're the one in control. Because sometimes at 2:13 a.m. on a ridge above the world, something out there might lean close just to remind you that you are being watched. And sometimes that reminder is exactly what keeps you alive. The night the mountain decided to speak to me, it did so with footsteps, slow, deliberate, and far too human to mistake for anything the forest could excuse. I remember the first sound as clearly as my own heartbeat. One crisp leaf crushed under weight, just beyond the nylon wall of my tent, a sound so sharp it sliced through the quiet like a warning. My name is Aaron, 34 years old, born and raised in a small valley town not far from the Georgia section of the Appalachian Trail, a place where the mountains roll like sleeping giants and the locals whisper old stories they pretend not to believe. I'd come to Blood Mountain for solitude, hoping to reconnect with the version of myself I used to trust, the one who hiked these trails as a teenager, who thought he knew the woods just because he grew up near them. But the mountain doesn't care where you're from. It judges you by how well you listen. And that night, just before 1:47 a.m., I learned how little I actually understood about being alone in real wilderness, especially wilderness that remembers more than it reveals. I had set up camp just off the trail, close enough to hear distant hikers, but far enough that the trees felt like a heavy curtain around me. Earlier that day, I'd spoken to a pair of locals at Mountain Crossings, the outfitter near Neal's Gap. The older one, a wiry man with a sunken jaw and pale eyes, asked where I planned to sleep. When I told him, he didn't smile, didn't nod. He just stared at my boots as if checking how deep a grave they could dig. He muttered something about circling walkers and time markers, and his companion nudged him sharply, the way you do when an elder starts telling stories tourists aren't meant to hear. I brushed it off at the time, too eager to escape my own thoughts to notice the way his fingers trembled when he warned me that this mountain holds on to people who wander in carrying unresolved things. I thought he meant loneliness. I didn't realize he meant regret, maybe guilt, maybe something heavier. Whatever it was, I carried it with me unknowingly, and I think the mountain sensed it long before I did. By sunset, the woods had folded into a stillness that felt almost respectful, like the silence before a prayer. I cooked a small meal, watched the sky shift from gold to violet, and crawled into the tent with the kind of tired satisfaction that only comes after a long hike. Yet beneath that satisfaction was something else, something like a knot pulling tighter in my chest. I blamed it on the altitude, on being alone, on the fact that 1 month earlier I had walked out of a relationship without saying the things I should have said, the things that lingered like a shadow under every quiet moment. Blood Mountain was supposed to be the place I sorted myself out, the place I faced the version of me I'd avoided for far too long. But instead, the mountain faced me first, and it began with those footsteps. The first pass around my tent was slow, almost curious, as if whatever was out there was studying the shape of me through the fabric. I held my breath, even as my heartbeat hammered so loudly I swore it must have echoed outside. At first I told myself it was a deer, or maybe a black bear. Animals move unpredictably, with stutters in their pace, with pauses that don't match human rhythm. But this was different. These were steps placed with intention. A slow crunch, a pause, another crunch. A perfect, deliberate circle. I checked my phone, 1:47 a.m., a time that would mean nothing on any other night, but now sits etched in my memory like a carved warning. I didn't unzip the tent. Some primal instinct told me not to. The woods have rules, and that night the rule was clear. Don't acknowledge what you can't explain. The footsteps completed 2 full circles before stopping just behind my head. My breath caught. The air outside felt too still, too cold, as if the forest itself were holding its breath with me. I reached for the knife in my pack, not because I thought it would save me, but because holding it made me feel less powerless. And then came the sound I still can't explain, a low, whispering exhale, inches from the tent wall, as though someone leaned close enough for their breath to push against the nylon. Not an animal. Not the wind, a person, breathing, listening, and yet not speaking, as if waiting for me to break first. My emotional dilemma wasn't fear of dying, not in that moment. It was the fear of being seen, truly seen, vulnerable, exposed, judged by something that walked the night without needing the comfort of fire or light. Something that understood the quiet truths a person hides inside themselves. Something that circled because it could hear the guilt I carried like a scent. I realized then that solitude doesn't hide your weaknesses. It amplifies them. And when you're alone in the mountains, your fear becomes a beacon. I don't know how long the breathing lasted. Minutes, maybe. hours, in the way terror stretches time into something unrecognizable. At some point it stopped, not by fading out, but by cutting off instantly, like something had been pulled away from the world. The silence that followed was worse. Silence meant it wasn't gone, only waiting. When dawn finally bled into the edges of the forest, I forced myself to unzip the tent, and there, in the soft, dew-covered dirt, were footprints, bare footprints, circling the tent in a perfect ring, large enough to be an adult man's, deep enough to show weight and tension. But here's the part that chills me even now. Every print faced inward, as if something had walked in circles all night, studying me, choosing not to enter only because it didn't need to. I stood there shaking, not from the cold, but from the realization that the locals hadn't been telling a story. They'd been giving a warning. And I, in my stubbornness, had walked straight into the jaws of something old, patient, and impossibly aware. And yet, I didn't run. I should have. Every instinct screamed at me to pack my gear and descend the mountain as fast as possible, but something stronger kept me rooted. A sudden, unexplainable need to understand why I had been circled, why I had been chosen. The prints weren't random. They were a message, a test, a boundary laid by something that wanted me to know I wasn't alone out there, no matter how deeply I tried to bury the truth. That realization shifted something inside me. It wasn't courage, it wasn't clarity, it was acceptance. The kind that comes only after a night that strips you down to the bone and shows you the pieces of yourself you've avoided for too long. The mountain had mirrored my internal chaos with footsteps in the dark, and now I had to decide whether to keep running from what haunted me or face it head on. I chose to stay. I chose to stay not because I felt brave, but because something in those perfect circles told me the mountain wasn't finished speaking yet. Fear has a way of hollowing a person out, leaving just enough space for truth to echo inside you. And as the sun strained through the pines, thin and hesitant like it didn't want to intrude on whatever had visited me the night before, I felt that echo more clearly than I ever had. I packed my gear slowly, not rushing the way a terrified person would. Every zipper, every click of a buckle felt louder than it should have, like the woods were listening. And maybe they were. The footprints were still there, darkened by morning dew, the inward-facing toes almost accusing, almost intimate. I crouched to touch one, barely brushing the indentation with my fingertips, half expecting it to be warm. It wasn't. It was cold as stone, cold as the realization that no matter how human the steps sounded, nothing human moved with that kind of patience. By midday, I had hiked higher up the trail toward the overlook where the rocks drop off and the view spills into endless rolling ridges. I thought distance might help me shake the feeling, the same way walking sometimes helps me outrun my thoughts. But the silence followed me. Even the birds seemed to hold their tongues, as if reluctant to break the memory of those steps. I found a clearing with a fallen log, sat down and forced myself to breathe in the scent of pine and soil, grounding myself the way I used to do as a kid when anxiety clawed at me. I told myself the night was behind me. I told myself I was safe. But fear doesn't listen to logic, especially not the kind that comes from a place as old as Blood Mountain. Then I heard it, a single footfall, not close, but distant enough to sound like a reminder rather than a threat. A single crunch of leaves, unmistakable and intentional. I froze. My pulse throbbed in my neck. The woods remained still. No wind, no rustling, nothing but that one sound echoing across the slope like a memory played out loud. I stood, scanning the trees, but there was no one, no shadow, no movement. Yet I knew I wasn't alone. Not in the way hikers sometimes pass nearby, but in a deeper, more unsettling way. The kind of presence you don't see because it doesn't need to be seen to affect you. For a moment, I considered heading back down the mountain. Pride is a fragile thing, and fear cracks it quickly. But something in me refused to let this story end with a retreat. I'd spent too many years backing away from conflict, too many nights sleeping with unresolved words pressing on my chest, too many days pretending emotions don't have claws. And maybe that's why this thing, whatever it was, had circled me. Maybe it sensed the weight I carried. Maybe it wasn't hunting me, but confronting me with the pieces I kept hidden. So I stayed. Not out of arrogance, not out of stubbornness, but because running felt like a second kind of death. As the afternoon deepened, I followed a narrow side trail that curled around the mountain's flank, a less traveled route known mostly by locals. The air felt heavier there, thicker somehow, as if the mountain wanted this part of itself kept quiet. Moss covered the rocks in velvety green sheets, and the light filtered through the canopy in long, tired strands. Somewhere far off, a crow called once, sharp, solitary, and the sound made every hair on my arms rise. I don't know why I kept walking. Maybe I wanted answers. Maybe I needed to prove something to myself. Or maybe there's a kind of momentum you fall into after fear breaks you open, this one that keeps you moving even when your legs want to turn back. The trail eventually led to a small rock shelf overlooking a dry creek bed, and that's where I found the second sign. Not footprints, not a shadow, but stones. Small, smooth stones placed in a perfect circle on the ground, 11 of them. Each one positioned with care, each one facing inward, just like the prints around my tent. My breath caught painfully in my throat. The arrangement wasn't natural. The stones were too uniform, too intentionally spaced. Something had made this. Something had taken the time to shape this symbol where someone like me would find it. I knelt, studying them. As I did, a strange sensation crept over me, like the air itself was pressing closer, listening again. I could almost feel the weight of the night before settling on my shoulders, the same invisible presence pacing around me, waiting for me to understand something I wasn't supposed to overlook. The emotional dilemma that had haunted me for months. Walking away from someone I cared about without speaking truths that might have changed everything felt suddenly connected to these symbols, as if the mountain was reminding me of the consequences of silence, as if it was showing me how avoidance invites things to circle you endlessly. Standing again, I stepped back from the stones, suddenly aware of how vulnerable I felt. The woods around me seemed tighter now, the air colder. And then deep beyond the tree line, I heard it again. Footsteps, not walking this time, approaching, slow at first, then stopping. Silence expanded like a held breath. My pulse thundered in my ears. I didn't move. Couldn't. The mountain had brought me here for a reason, and running now felt like betraying the lesson it was trying to teach me. And then, without warning, a voice, a whisper, drifted through the trees. Not words, not anything human. Just a sound shaped like a breath stretched thin. A sound that felt like it came from the earth itself. A sound that seemed to say, "Face it." In that moment, I understood something I can't fully explain. Fear isn't always a predator. Sometimes it's a guide, forcing you to confront the parts of yourself you've let circle you for too long. The footsteps weren't hunting me. They were mirroring me. Everything I'd avoided, everything I'd refused to confront, everything I carried but pretended not to feel, the mountain had given it a voice, a shape, a presence. My chest tightened, not with terror this time, but with clarity sharp enough to hurt. I whispered into the trees, quiet, broken, honest words I should have spoken long before this trip, not to beg, not to shield myself, but to release what I'd allowed to follow me. And the forest listened. When I finished, the woods exhaled, a soft stirring of leaves, a gentle shift of air. The presence receded, not disappearing, but allowing me space. The footsteps didn't return. The circles remained untouched, like monuments to a lesson learned in the hardest way. And for the first time since 1:47 a.m., I felt something close to peace. But peace in the Appalachian Mountains never comes without a shadow. And as I turned to head back toward the main trail, I felt eyes on my back, watching, not threatening, but reminding me that the mountain never forgets the people it teaches. I walked back toward the main trail with the attention of the forest pressed against me like a hand between my shoulder blades. Not pushing, guiding. The kind of presence that doesn't vanish after a moment of clarity but lingers, making sure you don't forget what you learned. Every step felt heavier than the last, not because of fear, but because of understanding. Fear had carved a space inside me, and now truth filled it. The woods around Blood Mountain weren't just scenery or silence. They were an ancient witness, a mirror, a keeper of old rules meant for people like me, those who carry unresolved weight into places where the land still remembers everything. The further I walked, the more the forest began to move again. A squirrel darted across a fallen log. A breeze finally pushed through the canopy, shaking loose a handful of leaves that drifted down like ash. Even the birds began to call softly, as though testing the air, unsure whether the threat had gone. But I knew something different. The presence hadn't left. It had simply stepped back, allowing me to finish what it started. The mountains in this region, especially near Blood Mountain, have a way of revealing the things that stalk you from the inside long before you recognize their shape. And once revealed, they never go silent again. By the time I reached Frogtown Gap, where the trail opens enough for sunlight to break through with real intensity, the weight on my chest had shifted. It wasn't gone. Some truths aren't meant to disappear, but it was no longer suffocating. The way grief becomes something you can carry instead of something that crushes you. I paused, letting the warmth hit my face, grounding myself in the simplicity of daylight. Daylight changes everything, but it doesn't erase the night. It only reminds you that surviving the dark means something. I kept moving, but the deeper I went, the more I sensed an unspoken tension beneath the surface of the forest. The same tension I'd felt before storms when I was a kid. A pressure low and building, like something waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. And it came just as the trail dipped into a stretch of laurel thickets, dense and shadowed. A soft crack of a branch somewhere behind me. Not loud, not rushed. Familiar. Footsteps. But this time they didn't circle. They followed. My breath caught, but I didn't turn around. The instinct to look over your shoulder is strong, primal, but every instinct in me said that acknowledging whatever walked behind me would give it power. Instead, I kept walking, each step carefully placed, controlled. The footsteps behind me matched my pace, not mimicking, tracking, and that was the moment I understood that the mountain wasn't punishing me. This was the continuation of the lesson. The circle around my tent was the confrontation. The stones were the message. These footsteps, they were the test. The trail narrowed, forcing me between two boulders slick with moss. If I panicked, I'd lose the moment. If I ran, I'd repeat every mistake I'd been trying to escape in my life, the habit of fleeing hard truths. So I stopped, not in defiance, not in surrender, in acceptance. The footsteps behind me stopped too. The woods went still, the kind of stillness that feels heavy enough to bend the air. I could feel my pulse in my teeth. I could feel the presence just beyond the reach of my shadow, close enough to sense intention, far enough to prevent form. And in that impossible silence, a realization settled into me. Whatever had circled me was not here to harm me. It was here to understand me and to make sure I understood myself. I spoke without turning around, not an apology, not an explanation, just the truth, stripped of fear, stripped of pretense, the truth I had never spoken aloud. And the moment the words left my mouth, the air shifted, a breeze rustled through the laurel, a bird launched into flight. Something exhaled behind me, not breath, not human, but the release of pressure, like a weight lifting from the woods themselves. The presence stepped back. The sound of it retreating was gentle, almost respectful. Leaves whispering, twigs yielding, like the mountain had accepted my offering. I finally turned, slow, cautious, expecting to see something. A figure, a shadow, a shape that fit the footsteps. But there was nothing. Just the trail, narrow and winding. Just the trees standing silent and tall. Just the forest returning to itself as though it had finished what it needed to do. Still, the dirt carried evidence, new footprints pressed lightly into the soil. Bare, human-shaped, leading away from me, fading into the thicket until their shape blurred into nothing but disturbed earth. The same inward-facing prints from the night before, but moving now in a direction with purpose, as though whatever had been circling me no longer needed to stay. I should have felt relieved, grateful even, but instead I felt a strange sadness, like the ending of a conversation with someone who understood me more deeply than anyone ever had. Something in those woods had listened to me in a way I had never listened to myself. By the time I reached the trailhead, evening was sliding back across the sky. The air felt lighter. The fear no longer gnawed at me, but a new awareness had taken its place, one I couldn't shake. The mountain hadn't shown me something supernatural to frighten me. It had shown me a reflection to guide me, and yet, as I loaded my pack into the truck, something made me pause. A small, perfect ring of stones sat on the hood, 11 of them, arranged in the same inward-facing circle I'd seen on the mountain. No footprints around it, no sign of disturbance, just the circle, waiting where I couldn't ignore it. My hands trembled as I brushed the stones aside, scattering them across the gravel. A gust of wind swept through the lot, cold and sudden, raising goosebumps along my arms. Because the message was clear: you may leave the mountain, but the mountain does not leave you. Not when it has marked you, not when it has taught you, not when it still follows. The night you realize the woods have been watching you is never the night you expect it. And for me, that realization came under the cold breath of Roan Mountain, long after the fire had died and the world had folded itself into silence. My name is Daniel Heston, 33 years old, born in Johnson City, raised on stories from locals who believed these mountains remember every footstep that crosses them. I'd camped the Appalachian highlands more times than I can count, grown comfortable with the rhythm of the forests, the whisper of spruce needles shifting their weight in the dark. And maybe that comfort is what blinded me to the one thing no seasoned hiker should ever forget. The mountains don't always want you here. It was late October when I decided to spend 2 nights near the Roan Highlands Balds, where the Tennessee and North Carolina border blurs into rolling tundra and stunted trees. I'd gone alone, something I rarely do now, but back then I still carried that young man's foolish certainty that nothing could shake me. Locals had been talking for weeks about strange lights reported near Carver's Gap, small floating orbs drifting above the ground, glowing a soft electric blue. Some people said they were atmospheric illusions. Others said they were something older, something this land carried long before our trails ever carved across it. I'd brushed those stories off like campfire exaggerations, the kind you tell tourists to make them tighten their jackets. But there was one older man, wirier than the roots of the rhododendron lining the trails, who stopped me outside a gas station and said in a low voice that the lights weren't the problem. The problem was when they stopped moving, because that's when, he said, they're watching you back. I pitched my tent near the tree line at the base of Round Bald, choosing a flattened area surrounded by thick underbrush. The air was colder than I expected, a creeping, damp cold that clung to the skin. I'd built a fire, eaten a simple meal, and settled in with the easy contentment that comes from miles of trail behind you. The sky that night was so clear that every star felt sharpened, as if the heavens themselves had edged closer. Nothing felt threatening. Nothing at all. And yet, sometime after midnight, the forest began to feel alert, like the trees were leaning in, listening. I'd felt that sensation before on deep walks in Cherokee National Forest, usually right before a storm or when a black bear wandered too close. But this wasn't the heaviness of weather, nor the quiet respect of wildlife. It felt like the land itself had inhaled and was holding its breath. I woke around 3:05 a.m., though woke might not be the right word. It was more like being pulled upward from sleep by something that didn't make a sound but still demanded attention. The fire had gone out. The coals were nothing more than a faint red memory beneath the ash. My breath came out white, curling into the darkness. At first I thought it was the cold that had stirred me, but the moment I sat up I saw it, a pale blue shimmer threading between the trees just beyond my campsite. Soft, slow, drifting. No bigger than a fist, but unmistakably unnatural. And just as locals had described it, the glow hummed without making a sound, as if the air around it trembled. I'd like to say I reacted with calm curiosity, but the truth is simpler and far more human. Fear hit me fast and deep. Not the sudden jolt of panic, something worse, a quiet, settling dread that pressed against my ribs and whispered that I should stay still. The orb floated about 6 feet off the ground, weaving in and out between the trunks of spruce like it was tracing a pattern I couldn't see. I didn't move. I didn't even blink for what felt like a minute straight. Every instinct told me this wasn't an animal, wasn't human, wasn't anything I had the vocabulary to explain. My mind raced through every rational possibility. Bioluminescent insects? No. Drone? Impossible. Too smooth, too fluid. A trick of the moonlight? The moon was behind the ridge. And just when I thought my fear had reached its peak, something happened that froze every thought in my head. The orb stopped. It didn't drift, didn't pulse, just halted midair, perfectly still. The old man's warning hit me like a stone to the sternum. The problem is when they stop moving, because that's when they're watching you back. Slowly, the light shifted direction. Not toward my tent, not toward the trail, toward me. The blue glow brightened, deepened, taking on an inner shape, almost like a pupil. And as ridiculous as it sounds, I felt someone examining me, the way you might study a stranger whose intentions you're uncertain of. My hands were trembling, my breath grew shallow. I could feel my heart beating so violently I swore it might crack a rib. And then, as if summoned or awakened by the stillness of that first orb, 2 more lights slipped into view from deeper in the forest. Then a 4th. Each one drifting independently, yet somehow all attuned to the same silent rhythm. I sat there paralyzed, the cold burrowing into my bones, watching these blue lights hold a loose triangular formation in front of me. Their shapes didn't cast shadows, they erased them. Wherever their glow touched the forest, the darkness receded in strange, unnatural gradients. And then, God help me, one of them blinked out, reappeared behind my tent, blinked out again, then appeared to my left, as if it could fold the space between one point and another without crossing the distance in between. My emotional dilemma that night wasn't simply fear. It was the unbearable tug of war between stepping forward to understand what was happening and staying rooted where I was to stay alive. I'd always believed that curiosity is what keeps adventurers alive, keeping you aware, alert, cautious. But curiosity that night felt like a trap. The lights seemed to respond to my breathing, growing brighter with every sharp inhale and dimming slightly with each slow exhale, as if measuring my calm, waiting for me to slip. And I couldn't shake the feeling that if I made one wrong move, one twitch too sudden, those lights would close the remaining distance between us. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. Time lost structure in that blue radiance. I could hear the forest holding its silence like a secret. Even the wind had gone still. And then, softly, like a footstep muffled in moss, I heard something move behind me. Not the lights, something else. Something heavy enough to bend branches, slow enough to not care if I heard it. My mind snapped into survival mode. I didn't turn around. Every instinct screamed that looking directly at it would break whatever precarious balance kept the lights from reacting. So I kept my eyes forward, locked on the nearest orb, and forced myself to breathe slower, gentler, quieter, hoping whatever was behind me would lose interest. But it didn't. The sound came again. Closer. A low, deliberate inhale that didn't belong to me. The blue lights stirred. I felt the world narrow into a single, sharp point of awareness. The weight behind me, the lights in front, the cold pressing against my skin like a warning. I was trapped between 2 unknowns, and for the first time in my life, I felt the woods not as a place of peace, but as a living thing deciding what to do with me. And that was when I understood the real fear. Not of the lights, not of the creature behind me, but of realizing I'm not the one observing the wilderness. The wilderness is observing me. The breath behind me grew steadier, deeper, like whatever stood there was drawing the cold night air into lungs far larger than mine. I could hear moisture shifting, the subtle pull of muscle beneath fur or skin, and all the while, the blue lights hovered in front of me without flickering, without dimming, as if waiting, no, listening. The terrifying thought hit me that the lights weren't the threat themselves. They were signaling something, marking me, or communicating with whatever was behind me in a language made from silence and presence. I didn't dare turn my head. Even the movement of my eyes felt risky. I kept them locked on the nearest orb, and for a moment, the world distilled into nothing but that cold, glowing point. It felt as if it was staring into me, not at me, sifting through my memories, my intentions, every trail I'd ever walked, judging whether I had earned the right to witness whatever this was. Then something shifted in the air. It wasn't wind. Roan Mountain had been dead calm for hours. No, this was different. It was as if the atmosphere itself thickened, like invisible weight settled around me. The forest seemed to draw even tighter into its silence. The creature behind me stopped breathing. The lights dimmed, syncing with one another. And in that suspended moment, I felt something like a question. Not spoken, not human. But there, pulsing in the stillness, asking if I belonged here. If I had come with respect or with arrogance. If I had listened to the warnings that this land had been whispering for generations. My chest tightened. My instinct was to justify myself, to explain that I grew up with these mountains, that I loved them, that every hike, every campout was an act of reverence. But the truth was harsher. I had camped alone not out of love, but out of stubbornness, brushing off the locals' warnings as superstition. I had walked into the highlands believing I understood everything worth understanding. I had assumed these woods owed me clarity just because I'd visited them often enough. And standing there, in the presence of something ancient and unblinking, I felt the weight of that arrogance pressing down hard. I lowered my gaze, not out of surrender, but out of humility. A quiet, instinctive gesture that felt right in a way I can't fully explain. The moment I did, the creature behind me exhaled, a slow, low sound, almost like approval. The lights brightened again, not menacingly, but with a strange softness. The nearest one drifted slightly upward, then retreated a few inches, as if the tension in the air had loosened. I didn't look up all the way. I let the forest decide the next move. The sound behind me grew distant. One slow step, then another, branches shifting with the careful precision of something that understood how fragile I was. The creature moved sideways instead of forward, circling the edge of the clearing. I felt its presence slide through the dark like a wave of pressure. It was tall, taller than any bear or elk I had ever encountered, and yet it moved with a kind of intention that didn't match the wild animals I knew. It wasn't hunting. It wasn't curious. It was guarding something, or judging my place in it. The lights responded to its movement, widening their formation, illuminating the faint outline of its shape through the trees. I never saw it fully, just the suggestion of mass, the faint impression of a shoulder brushing a low branch, the hint of height that made the world feel suddenly too small. My breath caught in my throat. The lights pulsed once in unison. And then, as if some silent decision had been reached, they drifted backward into the woods, one by one, fading deeper between the trunks. The creature followed. No rush, no aggression, just a slow, deliberate retreat. The last sound I heard from it was a soft crack of underbrush, then silence. True silence, the kind that only comes when the woods release their breath again. I stayed frozen longer than I want to admit, staring at the spot where the last orb had vanished, feeling the weight of the night settle back into something familiar. When I finally dared to move, my knees nearly buckled beneath me. The cold was sharper now, the kind that bites rather than clings. I crawled back to the fire pit with trembling hands and forced my fingers to work the lighter, the flint, sparking uselessly until finally the flame caught. The campfire sprang to life in a hesitant flare, casting shaking shadows across the clearing. Only then, with the warmth licking my hands, did I realize my face was wet. Not from tears, though fear certainly could have triggered them, but from something else. Dew? Condensation? I wiped my cheeks, and my hand came away slick with something faintly luminescent. A thin dusting of blue shimmered across my palm, glowing faintly like the lights that had hovered inches from my face. My stomach twisted. I rubbed my hand against my pant leg, but the glow didn't disappear. It just softened. I didn't sleep again that night. I sat awake until the sky began to lighten, until the outlines of the balds turned pink with dawn. Only in daylight did the forest feel like something I recognized again. The birds returned. The wind found its voice. But the place where the lights had hovered held a strange stillness, a patch of untouched earth that looked as though no creature, no human, had ever walked there. And the ground behind my tent where the creature had stood bore no tracks, no marks, not even disturbed soil, as if whatever had been there hadn't needed to obey the same rules of weight and presence that the rest of us do. When I packed up camp, I kept glancing toward the tree line, half expecting the lights to reappear. They didn't. And yet, as I hiked back along the trail toward Carver's Gap, I felt a strange clarity settle over me, a quiet understanding that what I had encountered wasn't meant to scare me away. It was meant to remind me of something I had forgotten, that these mountains are alive with memories older than our maps, older than our footsteps, older than anything we like to believe we've claimed. I don't pretend to know what the blue lights were or the creature that walked among them. I don't claim they were spirits or guardians or remnants of something ancient. But I know this: fear isn't always a warning to run. Sometimes it's the only language the wilderness has left to teach us humility. And on Roan Mountain, at 3:05 in the morning, I learned that lesson in the glow of lights that watched me with something far more human than eyes. And now, every time I return to those trails, every time I hear the wind sweep across the balds or watch fog curl between the spruces, I feel that same quiet question whisper beneath the rhythm of the woods. Are you walking with respect or with arrogance? Because somewhere out there in the shifting dark of Roan Mountain, the blue lights still drift, and they remember the answer you carry. I've learned that the mountains don't need to roar to warn you. Sometimes they whisper, and that's far more dangerous. My name is Caleb Turner, 43 years old, born and raised near the ridgelines of Southwest Virginia, and for most of my life, I believed I understood the ways of the Appalachian backcountry. But what happened in the Grayson Highlands last spring, what I witnessed in the thin hours before dawn, showed me just how little a man can grasp about the deep woods he loves. I still replay those moments in my mind when the wind shifts just right, when I catch the smell of cold stone or wet pine, when a far-off voice feels too clear to be real. And maybe I'm telling this story because part of me still hopes someone will explain what happened that night, while another part knows no explanation will make the memory sit any easier. The truth is, the mountains gave a warning. We just didn't understand it until it was too late. I'd driven up to Grayson Highlands with my friend Jonah, a wiry, restless 28-year-old trail runner I'd been mentoring for a couple of years. He trusted the woods the way youth trusts its own breath, thought the world would bend if he pushed hard enough. We were camping near the rhododendron gap, a place where the land opens wide and the sky feels close enough to touch. Locals say that gap carries strange sounds at night, that the wind travels in directions the trees don't. Even as a kid, I heard older hikers share stories of distant voices drifting over the balds, echoing in ways that didn't match the lay of the land. But locals also shrug things off. They'll warn you with a smile, as if superstition is just a friendly old neighbor. That night, those warnings felt heavier. It was cold enough that our breath hung like smoke trails, thin and ghostly. The wild ponies had already moved deeper into the ridges, leaving the grassy clearings to frost and silence. We set camp near a cluster of boulders, the fire crackling with that steady, comforting rhythm you feel in your chest more than in your ears. Jonah was excited, too excited for the hour, and kept talking about getting up before dawn to catch the earliest light over Wilburn Ridge. I kept telling him the trails freeze unevenly that time of year, that the sloped rocks turn slick like marble before sunrise. But Jonah was the kind of guy who believed warnings were just challenges wearing disguises. Sometime around 3 a.m, I woke to the feeling that something had shifted. Not a sound exactly, more like a pressure dropped. If you've camped long enough, you know what I mean. The air inside the tent felt heavier, like the world outside had paused. I unzipped the door quietly, trying not to wake Jonah, and stepped out into the night. The moon was thin, a cold sliver that barely gave shape to the world. The fire had burned down to orange coals that pulsed like a slow heartbeat. I stood there, listening to the kind of silence that isn't silence at all, it's just full of things holding their breath. Then I heard it. Faint, distant, stretched thin like someone calling from the bottom of a well. Caleb, my own name, soft, intentional, drifting over the ridge behind us. I froze. Every hair along my arms lifting. You can explain away wind, you can explain away coyotes or distant hikers, but you don't explain away your own name being spoken in a place where no one should be. For a long moment, I just stood there, pulse drilling in my ears. And then, just as quietly, another voice joined the first. Jonah. This one came from the opposite direction, down in the dark line of spruce toward the Thomas Nobbs shelter. It wasn't just a voice. It was Jonah's name said the way someone might say it right behind you, just before tapping your shoulder. I spun, scanning the tree line, trying to make sense of what I'd heard. But before I could react, I heard movement from behind me. Jonah unzipped the tent, stepping out barefoot, shirtless, eyes unfocused, like he was still somewhere between sleep and waking. I whispered sharply, asking him if he'd heard something, but he didn't answer. He just looked toward the dark, toward the place where his name had drifted up from the trees. And then, God help me, he smiled. Not a happy smile, not relief. It looked more like recognition, like hearing a familiar voice in a place where it shouldn't be, yet somehow welcoming it. Caleb, he whispered, someone needs help down there. There are moments in life when your fear doesn't come from what you see, but from what someone else believes they see. Jonah stepped forward, slow and dazed, as if pulled by something gentle yet irresistible. I grabbed his arm, but he twisted free with surprising strength. He whispered again, not to me, but to the darkness ahead. I'm coming. The way he said it chilled me deeper than the mountain air ever could. I tried to stop him, tried reasoning with him, shaking him, blocking his path, but he walked past me like he was moving through a dream, each foot deliberate on the frosted grass. I followed, panic clawing at my throat. I kept calling his name louder each time, but he didn't flinch. The voices came again, low and rhythmic, echoing faintly, overlapping like more than one person whispering in a cavern. Jonah, hurry. They weren't calling for me anymore. Only him. We moved deeper into the trees, the dark swallowing us. I knew these trails, I'd hiked them every season, and yet in those moments, nothing looked right. Landmarks seemed shifted, distances stretched. My flashlight beam felt swallowed by the cold itself. When we reached a narrow part of the trail, Jonah stopped so abruptly I nearly ran into him. He tilted his head, listening the way you listen to someone talking softly right beside your ear, and then he spoke quietly, almost reverently. They're lost. They need me. Something inside me snapped then, fear turning into a hard, desperate clarity. I grabbed him by both shoulders, shaking him hard enough his teeth clicked. There's no one out here, I hissed. You're sleepwalking. You're not thinking right. You're hearing echoes, or... He cut me off with a whisper that still haunts me. It's not echoes if they know your name. Then he tore himself loose and bolted down the trail. I chased him, stumbling over roots, branches slapping against my face. His silhouette flickered ahead of me, darting between the trees, and the voices, those impossible voices, grew sharper, faster, almost excited. This way. Keep coming. We're right here. But their direction kept shifting. One moment ahead, then beside us, then behind. They moved through the air like currents of water, slipping around the trunks, weaving between boulders, always just out of sight. I yelled for Jonah to stop, but he ran faster, as if he were chasing something only he could see. My lungs burned and the cold gnawed into my ribs. I lost sight of him briefly as the trail dipped into a hollow, and that's when the voices suddenly stopped, cut off mid-whisper, like someone had pressed fingers to unseen lips. The silence hit like a blow, a hollow, dead silence. I stumbled into the clearing where the trail flattened, panting hard, eyes scanning wildly. Jonah was gone. Only frost, only trees, only darkness. And then, from somewhere far deeper in the woods, barely audible, a scream, sharp, human. Jonah's. Then nothing. I didn't think, I just ran toward the sound, tearing down the trail so hard my boots nearly slipped on the frozen dirt. Every instinct in my body screamed that I was moving the wrong way, that no hiker should ever push deeper into the Appalachians in pitch darkness, following something they can't see. But fear isn't logical when someone you care about is calling for help, especially when you know the next scream might be their last. My flashlight barely held a beam, flickering with every jolt of my steps, and for a moment, the night around me felt alive with things shifting in the underbrush, as though the forest itself leaned closer to listen. When the beam steadied again, it illuminated nothing ahead, just the tight corridor of spruce and bare rhododendron branches clawing at the edges of my vision like fingers trying to pull me off the trail. I shouted Jonah's name so loudly it scraped my throat raw, but the sound died fast, swallowed into the trees like the mountains didn't want to give it back. When I reached the lower hollow where his scream had come from, the air felt colder, unnaturally still. Not the stillness of dawn, not the quiet before morning birdsong. This was the quiet of a cave deep underground, the kind of silence that feels thick, physical, almost intentional. My light swept over moss-coated rocks, a narrow stream crusted with ice, the twisted shadows of mountain laurel, but no Jonah, not even footprints where the frost should have broken. I knelt down, hands shaking, brushing the ground, searching for any sign he'd passed through. Disturbed leaves, a scuff mark, anything. But the earth beneath me looked untouched, as if he hadn't run ahead, but had simply dissolved into the air the moment he'd crossed into the hollow. The realization hit so hard it pushed the breath from my lungs. What I heard might not have been a scream at all. Or worse, it was, but Jonah wasn't anywhere a man could reach. I stood slowly, forcing myself to listen, hoping the voices would return, even if they terrified me. But the woods offered nothing. No wind, no movement, no distant call pretending to be a person, just cold. And the deeper I breathed, the more it felt like the forest was holding its breath with me. Then, faintly, too faint for direction, too faint for certainty, I heard something new. A dragging sound, like fabric, maybe skin against stone. It came from farther ahead, deep in a narrow ravine no marked trail crossed. I'd hiked these woods for over 30 years. I knew this area. That ravine led into old landslides, caves formed by collapsed granite, places where even experienced hikers avoided setting foot. But this was Jonah. I couldn't walk away from him. I couldn't return to camp alone. So I followed. The ground dipped sharply as I pushed toward the ravine, my breath stuttering in white plumes. Every part of me wanted to turn back, not because of fear, though fear clawed at me fiercely, but because something in my instincts kept whispering that I wasn't chasing Jonah anymore, that whatever lay ahead had lured him and was now luring me. But fear for someone else can overpower fear for yourself. That's the most dangerous thing about the woods. The moment you care about another person more than your own safety, the mountains can use that against you. At the mouth of the ravine, the dragging sound stopped. My flashlight hit a cluster of rocks slick with ice, a narrow crack between them, just wide enough for a body to slide through if someone forced themselves or were pulled. I crouched, lowering the beam. My chest tightened. The frost around the crack was melted in an uneven outline, like someone had touched it recently. And then I saw them, the faintest marks on the stone. Fingertip streaks. 4 of them, as if a hand had grasped the rock and been yanked inside. I whispered Jonah's name again, though it came out broken. If he answered, I didn't hear it. Instead, from deep inside the crack, too far, too muffled to be real, I heard something else. A breath. Slow, wet, close. The kind of breath a person makes when they're right behind you in a dark hallway. But this one came from within the rock, like something inside the mountain exhaled just once to let me know it was awake. I stumbled backward so fast I nearly fell, my heart hammering so violently I felt dizzy. I should have run right then. I should have climbed back up the trail and shouted for help until someone heard me. But the moment I turned away, something shifted in the air. A sound like a voice. Not Jonah's this time. Caleb, drawn out, softer than before, a whisper from directly behind me. I spun, light shaking wildly across the trees, but nothing stood there. No person, no animal, not even a shadow out of place. Yet the voice had been at my back, close enough that if it had breath, I should have felt it on my neck. My grip tightened on the flashlight until my fingers throbbed. The forest felt wrong around me, like the trees were leaning inward, branches overlapping to form a kind of barrier. I suddenly realized how far I'd come from camp, how deep into unmarked ground I'd let fear take me. The ravine had become silent again, utterly silent. That's when I felt something brush my leg. Not a tug, not a grab, just a light pass, a fingertip maybe, across the fabric of my pant leg. I leaped back instinctively, aiming the beam downward. Nothing, just frozen dirt and dead leaves. No tracks, no movement. The woods returned to stillness so quickly it made every muscle in my body lock. Whatever touched me wasn't trying to pull me, it was testing me, and that terrified me more than anything else that night. I backed away slowly, step by careful step, flashlight shaking so much the beam jittered across the ravine walls. I whispered Jonah's name one last time, not expecting an answer, only hoping the mountains would give him back in some form, any form. But the ravine stayed silent, and then, suddenly, the voices came again. Not calling to me, laughing. Soft, layered, echoing faintly like several people chuckling inside a tunnel. That broke me, truly broke me. I turned and ran. Branches whipped my arms, roots caught my boots, and I stumbled more than once, catching myself with hands numb from cold and panic. I didn't look back. Not once. The laughter followed, not loud but persistent, drifting between the trees as though keeping pace with me. Every time I slowed, even for a second, it seemed to draw closer. When I reached the main trail again, the laughter stopped abruptly, replaced by the distant cry of a lone pony in the highlands. Dawn was beginning to bleed into the sky as I burst back into camp, shaking uncontrollably. Jonah never returned. Not that day, not the next, not ever. His pack was still in the tent, his boots by the fire pit. Everything he'd brought was untouched. Search teams combed the trails for a week. They found nothing. No tracks, no clothing, no remains. Just one strange detail a ranger mentioned under his breath. There were places where the frost seemed disturbed in odd, circular patterns, not footprints, just impressions, as if something heavy had moved around without stepping. I stayed in Grayson Highlands until the last search team packed away their gear. And even as I drove home, I kept feeling like someone was whispering from the tree line, just beyond sight, saying my name the same way I'd heard that night. I haven't camped there since. I've learned that the quietest places in the Appalachian Mountains hold the loudest truths, and nothing prepares you for the moment you hear your own name swallowed by a forest that shouldn't know you exist. My name is Evan Morgan. I'm 34 years old, born and raised in Burnsville, North Carolina, just a short drive from Mount Mitchell, tallest peak east of the Mississippi, crown of the Black Mountains, and a place where the wind sounds like it remembers things you don't want it to. I grew up hiking these woods, camping in these ridges, thinking I understood them, thinking that being local meant being safe. But the night of December 12th changed that for me forever, because that night, at exactly 12:22 in the morning, the spruce forest screamed and kept screaming, long after every living thing should have been asleep. I'd gone up there alone, something I'd done countless times. There was comfort in the ritual of it. Park my truck at the pull-off, strap on my pack, walk until the last sign of human light faded behind me. It felt holy in a way, like entering a cathedral carved by wind instead of stone. The cold came early that night, sharper than usual, pushing through my jacket like a warning. I should have paid more attention to that first shiver crawling up my spine, but solitude has a way of making you arrogant. I told myself it was just the altitude, the season, the typical bite of Mount Mitchell in winter. I told myself I was prepared, that I knew these trails as well as my own heartbeat. But as I set up camp beneath the thick, shadow-loaded canopy of red spruce and Fraser fir, something in the silence around me felt unfamiliar. like the woods were holding their breath, waiting for something I hadn't yet noticed. Most people imagine wilderness fear as sudden, dramatic, explosive, but real fear in the mountains doesn't come like an ambush. It sneaks in slowly, like frost spreading across a window pane. My first hint was subtle. No birds, no rustling from small mammals, not even the distant crack of branches settling in the cold. It was a stillness far too complete for this place. Not dead, watching. I cooked quietly, the hiss of my small stove the only sound moving through the night. Even the flames felt uncomfortable, flickering low as if trying not to be seen. I ate fast, tucked my food away, tightened my tarp, and tried to shake the sense that something in the dark was pacing just beyond the edge of where my lantern reached. I've spent years teaching people how to read the woods, how to stay safe, how to trust their instincts before their logic catches up. But that night, even as my chest tightened, I ignored my own rule. Maybe because fear felt embarrassing. Maybe because I'd told too many stories around too many campfires about people who weren't prepared, and I didn't want to be one of them. Or maybe because there was a deeper reason, one I didn't admit until much later. I wasn't ready to believe that a place I loved could turn on me, that a mountain could reject you like a living thing. I crawled into my sleeping bag around 11, the cold sharp enough to feel like needles against my face. I remember checking my watch, 11:03 p.m., and thinking I'd fall asleep quickly. Instead, I lay awake for what felt like hours, listening to the unnatural quiet pressing against my tent walls. My heartbeat became the loudest thing in the forest. I tried to breathe slower, tried to calm the rising paranoia, but every inhale felt heavy, and every exhale came out too fast. And then, somewhere far off, so faint I questioned if I imagined it, I heard what sounded like a single clipped sob. Not an animal, not wind, a human sound, one that didn't belong in miles of wilderness at that hour. The next sound wasn't faint. A scream tore through the forest like the mountain itself had split open. Raw, high, terrified, and undeniably human. It didn't echo like a normal scream, no bouncing off ridges, no fading into the valleys. It went straight through the trees, sharp and direct, landing deep in my chest like a physical blow. My breath stopped, my body stiffened. I waited for another scream, or voices, or footsteps, anything that could make the moment make sense. But the silence swallowed everything again. And that silence was worse than the scream. When I looked at my watch, the numbers glowed 12:22 a.m. I don't know what compelled me to unzip my sleeping bag, or why I whispered to myself that someone needed help. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was stupidity. Maybe the forest knows how to pull you where it wants you. I stepped out into the freezing air, boots crunching softly on the frost-coated ground. My breath rose in slow, ghostly clouds. I swept my lantern toward the trees, expecting to see another camper, a lost hiker, a fallen stranger. But the woods stood still as statues, branches heavy with darkness. Nothing moved. Then, from my left, deeper in the spruce thicket, I heard a second sound. Not a scream this time, but quick, frantic breathing, like someone was running and trying not to cry. I turned toward it, lantern trembling in my hand, trying to convince myself that if someone was close enough to hear, they were close enough to save. The breathing grew louder, then softer, shifting direction like whoever it belonged to was circling or being chased. My pulse pounded so hard I felt it in my teeth. The cold air burned my lungs. I called out softly, "Are you hurt? Do you need help?" But the moment my voice broke the silence, all breathing stopped. That was when I finally understood something was wrong in a way I'd never known the woods could be wrong. Footsteps began behind me, light, slow, deliberate. Not hiking strides, not panicked running, just following. I spun around, lantern beam shaking across the trees, but there was no silhouette, no reflection of eyes, no sign of anything. Yet the footsteps continued, crunching frost one step at a time. Closer, closer. My throat tightened so hard I couldn't swallow. Every piece of logic I had, the years of wilderness experience, the training, the rational explanations I'd always leaned on, collapsed under the weight of a single truth. Footsteps should have a source. And these didn't. The emotional dilemma hit me with full force. I was torn between going deeper into the woods to search for whoever screamed or running back to camp and pretending I hadn't heard anything at all. The guilt dragged one arm forward, the fear dragged the other back. And in the middle of that pull, something unseen made the decision for me, because something whispered my name. Not shouted, not moaned. Whispered, close enough that I felt the breath of it graze the back of my neck. Evan. My lantern flickered violently as I stumbled backwards, heart slamming against my ribs so hard I thought it might bruise from the inside. I couldn't move. I couldn't think. The name hung in the air like a thin layer of frost. I'd never felt fear so brutally personal, like the forest itself had reached inside me and pulled out the part of me I kept most guarded, my identity, my memories, the core of who I was. When the scream came again, louder this time, closer, I ran. Branches whipped at my face as I sprinted through the dark, tripping over roots, slipping on patches of ice, my lungs burning from cold and terror. I didn't look back. I didn't dare. My only thought was distance. Put as much space as possible between me and that voice, that scream, that unseen presence that knew my name. I didn't recognize where I was running. Trails blurred, trees blended together. My legs moved without direction, driven by pure survival. It wasn't until I fell, hard, sliding down a shallow ditch, that I realized the screaming had stopped, and the silence that followed wasn't the same silence as before. This one felt relieved, like whatever hunted the sound had gotten what it needed. I lay there shaking, staring up at the narrow slice of starless sky. My watch beeped once, a random glitch I'd never heard before, and I raised my wrist. The display flashed, 12:22 a.m., over and over, refusing to change. And then, from somewhere in the forest behind me, something began humming, a low, rhythmic vibration that made the ground tremble beneath my palms. I forced myself to stand, forced my legs to move, forced myself to climb out of that ditch and orient toward the faintest suggestion of a trail. I walked as fast as my legs would allow. I didn't stop. I didn't look behind me. I didn't breathe fully until I saw the tiny reflection of my truck's taillight far down the access road, a single red pinprick glowing like salvation. When I finally slammed the door shut and locked it, the humming stopped. The mountains went still again. But the air, God, the air, still felt like it was waiting for me to open the door again, just once, just enough for it to whisper my name one more time. I drove away with my headlights off for the first mile, terrified that light would attract whatever had been walking behind me. I didn't look in the rearview mirror until I reached the main road, and even then I was afraid I'd see someone, or something, standing in the beam of my taillights. I didn't, but that didn't comfort me the way it should have, because the real horror wasn't just what followed me that night. It was the lesson beneath it, one I didn't want to learn, but had to. In the Appalachian Mountains, not everything that screams wants to be found. And if the forest ever whispers your name, it means it already knows where you'll run. I never understood how quiet the Appalachian night could be until the moment that silence finally turned on me, swallowing every familiar sound and leaving only the pulse of something watching from the tree line. My name is Caleb. I'm 34, born and raised in Kentucky, and I've spent most of my adult life walking these woods like they were the only place that ever made sense. But the older I get, the more I realize the forest doesn't welcome you. It tolerates you the way a sleeping animal tolerates a fly crawling on its back, and when it decides you've stayed too long, it lets you know. I set out for Red River Gorge on a cool October afternoon, thinking I knew these trails well enough to move through them like a ghost myself. I didn't know then that something much older, much quieter, was already moving with me. I chose a primitive site just off Swift Camp Creek, the kind of place locals talk about in half sentences. They'll say things like, "You can camp there if you want," or "That holler's fine most nights," before shrugging and walking away. That's the Appalachian way of warning you. Never direct, never dramatic, but careful, respectful. My grandmother used to say these woods remember everything. Every footstep, every mistake, every secret. And I guess part of me went out there hoping to prove something, not to anyone else, but to myself. I'd been feeling trapped in my own life lately, working too much, starting to forget what it felt like to breathe air that hadn't been recycled through a vent. The forest was supposed to be the reset button. But when you come here already carrying something heavy inside you, the woods tend to answer. By sunset, the fog had crept low across the creek like it had been waiting for nightfall to move. The sky cooled into that deep Kentucky blue, the kind that feels close enough to touch, and I sat there listening to the wind comb through the hemlocks. I warmed my hands over the small fire and felt for a moment like I was exactly where I was meant to be. But even then, something was off. It was subtle, just a small discomfort, like sitting in a room where one picture frame is slightly crooked. You can ignore it, but your brain keeps tugging at it. I kept scanning the woods without knowing why, as if my mind had caught a mistake before my eyes could. I tried brushing it off as nerves. Everyone gets uneasy in the wilderness after dark. But this was different. It was a pressure, almost a presence, sitting just outside the glow of the fire. I told myself not to be dramatic. I ate, cleaned up camp, zipped the tent, and lay back against my sleeping pad. I listened to the creek, to the occasional rustle of leaves, to the whip-poor-will calling somewhere near the ridge. But under it all, threaded through every sound, I felt that same wrongness, like someone standing behind you in a dark room, holding their breath so you can't hear them. Around 1:30 a.m., something snapped me awake. Not a noise, not a dream, just the sudden, overwhelming sense that I wasn't alone anymore. My fingertips were cold. My breath felt heavy in my chest. I know fear can play tricks, but my fear has never lied to me. My fear has kept me alive more times than my pride ever did. I listened, barely breathing, trying to pinpoint what had changed. The creek sounded the same. The frogs and bugs still hummed. But there was something else, something just beneath it all, a rhythm that didn't belong, a slow, deliberate cadence. Footsteps on damp leaves. I didn't sit up, didn't move. I just stared at the roof of the tent, watching the faint orange flicker from the dying fire outside. The footsteps circled once, twice, slow, curious. Whatever it was wasn't a deer. They move with confidence or chaos, nothing in between. This was measured, heavy enough to be human, light enough to be wrong. My first instinct was to call out, to say something, anything, to break the tension. But a deeper instinct held my tongue. Something told me that acknowledging it would have been a mistake. So I stayed perfectly still, feeling each beat of my heart thudding against the sleeping pad. Then the footsteps stopped right beside my tent. Not moving, not shifting, just standing there. I don't know how long it stayed. Time loses meaning when fear rewrites the rules. But eventually the presence seemed to drift back toward the tree line. I waited until I couldn't hear it anymore, until I could finally force myself to breathe again. I told myself it had to be a hiker or a hunter, someone camping illegally, someone with a reason to be out here. But even as I formed the excuses, I didn't believe a single one. The woods themselves felt tense, like they were holding a breath they didn't want to release. Sleep never came back after that. I sat in silence until the fire was just a smolder and the cold crept in through the tent walls. At 4:10 a.m., just when the black sky began to thin into something softer, something shifted again. A sound, not loud, but unmistakable, like someone exhaling right beside the tent fabric, a slow, steady breath. Too close, too familiar. My body locked up. Every instinct screamed to run, to tear out through the opposite wall of the tent and sprint blindly into the trees. But I forced myself to stay still, to listen, to understand what exactly I was dealing with. The breath came again, slow, deliberate, almost testing me. And then just as the fire's last ember gave one final crack, I saw it. A shadow, impossible but real, stretching across the thin nylon wall, perfectly shaped like a person kneeling inches from my head. The figure didn't move, didn't sway with the wind, didn't shift or dissolve. It stayed perfectly still, as if waiting for me to acknowledge it. My mouth went dry. My hands trembled. My thoughts scattered, turning wild and primal. But underneath the fear was something else. Something I didn't expect. Shame. Because the truth is, I hadn't come out here just to camp. I'd come out here running from my own life, from choices that were catching up to me. And when you're already haunted, the woods don't hide your ghosts. They show them to you. I don't know how long the figure stayed, but when it finally rose, its shadow stretching impossibly tall against the tent, I felt the air shift with it. The breathing stopped. The pressure lifted. The forest exhaled, and for the first time that night, I felt the world return to itself. I lay there frozen, heart still hammering, waiting for footsteps that never came. When I finally unzipped the tent, the world outside was cold and gray, the sky just starting to brighten. But the ground was wrong. Leaves pressed down, soil disturbed, a perfect imprint of knees in the dirt, as if someone or something had crouched there for hours, waiting for me to wake up. The imprint in the soil didn't scare me at first. It confused me. It made my mind fumble for explanations the way you reach for a light switch in a dark room, remembering too late that the power's out. I crouched beside the marks, touching the cold earth with the back of my fingers. They weren't fresh, but they weren't old either. Whatever, whoever, made them had weight. Not the soft press of an animal, not the scattered shape of a deer kneeling. These were deliberate, human, but they sank too deep, like whoever was there wasn't just kneeling, but lowering themselves with intent, with an unnatural stillness that the woods shouldn't allow. I scanned the tree line, my breath fogging in the morning air. The world looked normal, pale light, damp leaves, the slow awakening of the forest. But I felt like the night hadn't actually ended. Like it was hiding somewhere behind the trees, waiting for me to make a mistake. I told myself to pack up. Logic, fear, instinct, everything pointed in one direction: leave. But another part of me, the part that had dragged me out here in the first place, kept whispering, you can't run from something if you don't understand it. And that whisper annoyed me because it was right. I didn't want to spend the rest of my life wondering what circled me at 4:10 a.m. I didn't want the shadow to follow me home, to show up in the corner of my bedroom or in the reflection of a window. You can leave the woods, but you don't leave what the woods showed you. So instead of breaking camp, I grabbed my thermos, walked down to the creek, and tried to breathe. Red River Gorge is beautiful at sunrise, ridges blushing with early light, cliffs glowing like embers. But that morning, the colors felt wrong, dimmer somehow, like the world had been drained a shade. I kept glancing over my shoulder, listening for footsteps behind me, waiting for the cold breath against my neck that had woken me hours earlier. I sat on a flat rock near the water and tried to center myself. I told myself the same thing I've told dozens of terrified hikers over the years. Fear is a message, not a verdict. But the message that morning was tangled. It wasn't warning me about the woods. It was warning me about myself. I'd been carrying something for months. Regret, guilt, the kind that sits behind your ribs and rots slow. And the woods, in their strange old way, had reflected it back at me. You think you're alone out here, but you're not. You bring every version of yourself, every mistake, every shadow. And sometimes, when the forest is quiet enough, the shadows step forward. That thought unsettled me more than the figure itself, because suddenly it felt like whatever watched me last night wasn't a creature of the forest, but something drawn out of me, something I'd been avoiding. I walked upriver, deeper into the holler, needing space to think. The fog hovered low over the water, clinging to the surface like it didn't want to rise. My boots sank into the soft moss, and each step felt heavier than it should. The deeper I went, the quieter the world became. The birds stopped, the insects faded, even the creek seemed to hush itself. And when a place in the wild goes silent like that, it's never an accident. I slowed down, scanning the trees. For a moment, nothing moved. Then, just as I stepped over a fallen log, I saw it. Across the creek, between two massive hemlocks, a figure. Still, dark, tall enough that it shouldn't have blended with the trees, but it did, like it had been carved out of the shadows themselves. My throat tightened. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. The figure didn't step forward, didn't shift its weight. It just stood there, blurred slightly by the rising mist. Its outline was human, but its head was wrong, too elongated, tilted, like it was listening to something I couldn't hear. And in that moment, I understood something instinctively. The imprint beside my tent wasn't where it approached me. It was where it waited, where it watched, where it learned me. A cold wave ran through my chest, not panic, but realization. Whatever this was, it wasn't curious about my campsite. It was curious about me. I stepped back, and the leaves crunched under my boot. The figure tilted its head further, the motion slow and deliberate, like it wasn't bothering to hide anymore. I didn't run, not because I was brave, but because running felt like an invitation. Like turning my back would give it permission to close the distance between us. Instead, I walked backward, each step measured, my breath trapped in my throat. When I blinked just once, the figure wasn't there anymore. Just empty space, just trees, just the sound of the creek rushing again, as if the forest itself had been released from whatever spell held it still. I kept retreating until I reached my camp. My hands shook as I broke down the tent, stuffing gear into my pack with movements that didn't feel like my own. My heart hammered hard enough to make my ribs ache. But something urged me to hurry, a pressure, a certainty that the woods were shifting behind me. Every second I stayed was a second too long. When everything was finally strapped down, I swung the pack over my shoulders and started toward the trailhead. But the forest wasn't done with me. About halfway up the ridge, the wind dropped again. The air turned thick and unmoving, like the whole world was holding its breath. And then, clear as the creek beside my camp, I heard footsteps behind me. Slow, heavy, following, matching my pace. I didn't turn around. Turning around felt like the worst mistake I could make. Instead, I kept moving, forcing my legs to climb the steep trail, my palms sweating around the straps of my pack. The footsteps stayed exactly 2 seconds behind mine, not gaining, not falling back. Then they stopped. The silence that followed was so complete it felt alive, like something was waiting for me to react. I kept my eyes forward, focusing on the bend in the trail where the sunlight finally touched the ridge. When I reached it, when my boots finally broke into the open light, I stopped. I didn't hear anything behind me. No breath, no footsteps, nothing. I waited. The woods stayed still, but I knew, in my bones, in the part of me that the forest had dragged to the surface, that whatever followed me wasn't gone. It just chose to stop. And suddenly the emotional truth hit me with terrifying clarity. I wasn't being hunted. I was being judged. I still remember the way the air felt that night, dense, metallic, like the sky itself was holding its breath above the Linville Gorge, and how even before anything happened, something in me whispered that the darkness here carried a weight older than the trail I'd hiked in on. My name is Evan, 34 years old, born and raised in Western North Carolina, and I've spent most of my life slipping in and out of these mountains the way some people slip in and out of their own memories. I thought I knew them, thought I'd grown up enough around locals, rangers, and old-timers to understand when a story was just a story, and when it was a warning told quietly, eyes down, as if fear could call something by name. But nothing in all my years around these woods prepared me for what happened at 2:40 in the morning when my tent shook like something, not someone, had grabbed it with both hands. I had arrived earlier that afternoon, hiking in from the Table Rock side, planning to spend one night alone near the river before heading deeper into the gorge at sunrise. The trail was familiar, but the solitude felt different this time. Too complete, too sudden, like the wind itself had pulled back into the trees. A Cherokee elder once told me that the gorge holds on to things, stories, sorrows, people who walk in thinking they're just passing through. He said the land remembers everything long after the people are gone. I laughed at the time, but the closer I got to my camp spot, the quieter the forest became, and the more I felt like I wasn't walking alone. It wasn't a sound I heard so much as a presence, like a second heartbeat pacing itself against my own. Setting up camp helped shake it off. The rhythm of it, the poles sliding into fabric, the thump of the stakes into soil, the crack of branches I gathered for a fire, grounded me. I cooked dinner under a sky scraped by sharp ridgelines, clouds dragging low and heavy across the moon, the kind of night where every shadow feels like it's listening. I ate quickly and let the fire burn down slower than usual, comforting myself with that small circle of light. I'd come here because I needed the clarity this gorge always forced out of me, the way it stripped distractions, leaving only thought and instinct. I'd been wrestling with a feeling for a while, that maybe I'd been pushing too hard through life on autopilot, letting fear make decisions for me, not danger, but the fear of missteps, of failing people, of failing myself. And something about these mountains always had a way of cornering me into honesty. But that night, honesty took on a shape I didn't expect. Because once the fire died and the cold took its place, I realized something had settled around my camp that wasn't there before. The air didn't just chill, it thickened, like something was standing just out of sight, watching the last ember fade. I crawled into my tent around 11:30, zipped the door, and lay there listening to the forest breathe. The gorge at night is a strange mix of silence and sound. The river's distant murmur, the creak of pines bending in the dark, the occasional rustle of deer or raccoons. But around midnight, something shifted. The sounds didn't vanish. They fell backward, muffled, as if I were hearing them from underwater. What replaced them wasn't silence, but a steady, low vibration in the ground beneath me, like someone dragging something heavy across stone somewhere far away. I propped myself up on my elbows, heart thudding. The vibration came in waves, distant, then closer, then distant again, never settling into a pattern. I tried to convince myself it was rockfall somewhere on the cliffs, but every explanation felt too small compared to the unease crawling up my spine. And the strange thing was, I wasn't scared, not yet. I was unsettled, sure, but part of me leaned into the uncertainty. Maybe it was the reason I came out here, to confront whatever stirred inside me when the rest of the world went quiet. I must have drifted into a half sleep, because the next thing I remember with clarity was the exact time glowing on my watch, 2:40 a.m. And then came the shaking. It wasn't gentle, wasn't the wind catching the tent walls. It was deliberate, a hard, violent yank from one side, pulling the entire tent 2 inches across the ground. My heart slammed into my throat so fast it felt like it stuck there. I froze, breath caught as another jerk hit the opposite side, harder this time, snapping one of the poles so loud the crack echoed inside my skull. Something was outside, and it wasn't walking, breathing, or sniffing the tent like a bear or coyote would. It wasn't circling. It was standing still, shifting its weight, hands, I swear they were hands, gripping and releasing the fabric as if testing it. Fear is a strange creature. It doesn't always burst into you. Sometimes it crawls in slow, like cold seeping through your bones. I wanted to speak, to shout, to scare whatever it was away, but my voice wouldn't form. All I could hear was the blood rushing in my ears and the fabric stretching where something pulled with inhuman strength. And in that moment, the emotional dilemma that had been following me for months came crashing forward. I was tired of running from fear, tired of letting it dictate who I was. But when something tries to tear your shelter open in the middle of the night, courage suddenly becomes a distant idea, not a choice. My hands fumbled for my knife, but I could barely keep my grip steady. I didn't want to stab at something I couldn't see. I didn't want to provoke what might already be deciding whether I lived or died. Then, the shaking stopped. Just stopped. The air outside the tent grew so still it felt staged, like the forest was waiting for my next move. I held my breath until my lungs burned, then released it in a slow, trembling exhale. I didn't unzip the tent. Didn't dare. I sat there in total darkness, clutching my knife, back pressed against the sleeping bag, waiting for whatever was outside to finish whatever it had started. And that's when I heard it. Faint, distorted, and impossibly close. A voice. Not a word, not even a whisper. A sound shaped like breathing, but wrong. Too deep. too slow, like something that had never needed lungs was trying to mimic how humans inhale. I stayed frozen until the first hint of dawn, the faint gray that slips into the forest like a hesitant guest. Only when birds began to chirp again did I unzip the tent and step out, knees shaking, knife still in my hand. Nothing was there, no prints, no tracks, no sign that anything had stood inches from where I slept. But the tent had been dragged, poles bent, fabric stretched. You don't imagine that. You don't dream that. Something touched it. Something shook it. Something tried to get inside. And as the morning light spilled down the canyon walls, I realized something I still struggle to articulate. Whatever visited my camp that night wasn't trying to hurt me. It was trying to see me. And somehow that was infinitely worse. I stood there in the pale morning light, every muscle in my body still coiled tight, as if the forest might suddenly remember what it almost did to me. But even as the fog thinned and the river's voice drifted up from somewhere below, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had gripped my tent still lingered between the trees, watching with a patience that felt older than the gorge itself. It wasn't curiosity I sensed. It wasn't hostility either. It was something deeper, an intelligence measuring me, weighing me, deciding what to do with the fear it had planted in my spine. And the more I looked around, the more I realized how exposed I truly was, standing on a patch of earth that seemed suddenly too small, too vulnerable. But leaving immediately felt wrong, like turning my back would give the thing exactly what it wanted. So I steadied my breath, tightened my grip on the knife, and forced myself to confront the damage. The tent poles bowed at unnatural angles, not snapped like from brute force, but twisted, almost examined. The stakes were pulled halfway out of the earth, disturbed not by claws, but something that knew how to grasp. And the ground around the tent, though lacking tracks, had been smoothed in a way I couldn't explain, like the soil itself had shifted to cover any signs of disturbance. A part of me wanted to pack up and run, but another part, the part of me that had come here seeking clarity, seeking some answer to the unrest that had been building inside me for months, knew I couldn't just leave without understanding what happened. That was the emotional dilemma tearing at me, the instinct to flee, battling the deeper, quieter voice urging me to stay and face whatever truth the gorge still held. I walked the perimeter of my campsite, scanning every root and shadow. The forest was waking, birds calling in scattered bursts, but beneath that normal morning sound was something off, something dissonant, a stillness between the notes. The trees looked the same, the air felt the same, the path was where I left it, but I wasn't the same. And I think the gorge knew it. I knelt near the riverbank, scooping cold water into my hands, trying to calm the tremor that wouldn't leave my fingers. The water helped, sharp and grounding, but when I lifted my head, I noticed something upstream that made my entire chest tighten. A line of rocks, small, flat river stones, stacked in a delicate spiral, perfectly balanced, right at the edge of the water. I hadn't made it. No hiker would have left something that fragile where the current could swallow it overnight. It hadn't been there the day before, and the shape of it, the spiral curled inward, tightening into a single point. The same way the dragging sound I'd heard in the night had come and gone in waves, always circling, always narrowing, as if searching for something. Or someone. A cold realization slid into me. Whatever shook my tent hadn't wandered into my camp by accident. It had been circling long before I ever heard it. And the spiral was a mark, a sign, maybe even a message. Not meant to scare, but to communicate in a language that wasn't meant for people. As the sun climbed higher, warming the jagged cliffs around me, the weight in the air finally loosened its grip, but not enough to free me from the unease threading through every thought. I dismantled what was left of my tent with slow, shaky movements, folding the fabric with more care than necessary, because my mind kept replaying the moment at 2:40 a.m. when the entire structure had lurched beneath invisible hands. I couldn't deny it anymore. Something in these woods had acknowledged me. And the worst part was knowing that leaving wouldn't undo that recognition. I had crossed some line in the night, stepped into some space between my world and whatever shadows lived beyond it, and now I carried the imprint of that crossing with me. I slung my pack onto my shoulders and started up the trail, choosing the longer route out, the one that wound along the ridge where you can see the gorge open up like a scar in the earth. The climb burned in my legs, but the rhythm steadied my breath, gave me something to hold on to. Still, every time the wind shifted, I felt a prickle at the back of my neck, like a reminder that I wasn't entirely alone. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to catch a figure on the trail behind me. Tall, thin, the kind of silhouette that would blend with tree trunks if it stood perfectly still. But the path stayed empty, the woods indifferent. That almost made it worse. Because fear of being followed is simple. Fear of something choosing not to follow, but still watching, is a different kind of terror. Halfway up the ridge, I stopped to catch my breath at a familiar overlook, the kind where the world stretches out in layered blues and greens, mountains stacked like distant memories. I'd stood here countless times, but this time I didn't feel awe. I felt observed, as if the gorge itself was the thing breathing behind me. I set my pack down, the fabric brushing against my side in a way that made me flinch harder than I meant to. My nerves were stretched thin, humming like a wire pulled too tight. And yet, beneath all that fear, something inside me stirred, something I didn't expect. It was the faintest whisper of resolve, a steadying voice telling me that maybe this encounter wasn't meant to break me. Maybe it was meant to confront the part of me that had spent too long running from shadows, internal and external. I stood at the overlook until my breathing softened, until the tremor in my hands settled into something manageable. The wind brushed past, carrying the scent of pine and cold stone, and though it chilled me, it carried no malice. And that's when it hit me, not as a fear, but as a truth I didn't know how to name. Whatever shook my tent that night hadn't just approached me. It had chosen me. And the spiral, the silence, the dragging sound, they weren't warnings. They were acknowledgments. As if the gorge had reached out to remind me that there are things in this world we're not meant to understand, but we are meant to respect. I left the overlook slowly, stepping back onto the trail with a strange heaviness in my chest. Not dread, not relief, but something in between, like the weight of a secret you didn't ask for but now have to carry. And as the forest closed around me again, the shadows flickering between the branches, I realized the gorge hadn't tried to push me away. It had tried to show me something. And whatever that something was, it had changed me in a way I couldn't undo.